Welcome to today's webinar, Election Security, Voters, and COVID-19. I'm Jimmy Baker with Cal Poly's California Cybersecurity Institute, and I'll be your moderator today. Cal Poly Cybersecurity Institute teaches Californians how to protect California. You can learn more about our training and research by the website on your screen right now. We have a busy agenda for the next 30 minutes. I know when we were talking with people and promoting this event, I had a lot of questions that came in and said, can you all actually do all this in 30 minutes? The answer is yes, we can. And what we're gonna do right around 11:30 is we're gonna stay online for another 15, 20 minutes. We've had multiple questions come in from all over America joining us today, and that we'll try to answer. Before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we want to go over. Kindly mute your microphones. As we mentioned, your questions are important to us. On the call today, we have people from Washington, D.C. all the way to California and everywhere in between. Use the chat feature. We will be monitoring the questions. Please note that this event is going to be recorded today. We will send everyone listening out an on-demand link after the event. I wanted to let you know about some upcoming trainings that you might be interested in. On September 10th, we're going to do a deeper dive on the concepts that you hear about today. Registration will be open next week, and we'll send everyone listening today some more information on that. And then, of course, after the election, we are going to do an analysis of the 2020 presidential election. We hope you all will join us for that. I want to take a moment. An event like this involves a lot of coordination, a lot of people. We're grateful for Amazon and Cal Poly's Digital Transformation Hub for helping promote this event. Now, if you all would bear with us just a moment, we want to get your feedback on what are the top election security issues facing your organization or your community. You will see a poll come up on your screen here. Please take a moment and answer that. And we'll keep this up for just a few more seconds. In the event that there's something there that we didn't capture, feel free to chat us and we'll include that in the survey. All right, we're gonna get ready to end the poll. Just take another quick moment and check a box. We're seeing a lot of answers come in on responding to cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, and boy, do we have a lot to say about that today. All right, we're gonna end the poll and we're gonna move on. It is my pleasure to announce our speakers for today's event. Cal Poly's California Cybersecurity Institute, we have teamed up with the OSET Institute and TrusttheVote Project. John, could you kindly introduce yourself to the audience?
There we go. I'm John Sebas. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the OSET Institute. You can read various nicely worded things about me, but to be more brief, it's the job of all of us at the OSET Institute to identify election technology gaps that are facing election officials where they don't have the technology they need to do their job with the excellence that they would like. And it's my job, leading the technical team, to run technology development projects to fill those gaps. And that's the short story about me, and I believe Eddie is up next.
I am, and I hope everybody can hear me. Yes. Delighted to be here. Many thanks to Cal Poly's Cybersecurity Institute and to Amazon, and most importantly, thanks to everyone who's attending. We really appreciate it. My name is Eddie Perez. I am the Global Director of Technology Development at the OSET Institute. My expertise ranges in a variety of election infrastructure and election administration areas. I have been with the OSET Institute since November of 2018. And before joining the OSET Institute, I spent about 16 years dealing with election technology, voting technology in particular, working for one of the US's 3 major providers of voting systems. And in that capacity, I also had the pleasure for those almost 2 decades of working with the people that really make elections go. And that, of course, is election administrators across the country, really being in the trenches and providing a lot of support. And at the OSET Institute, particularly this year with so many changes, a lot of the work that I do is devoted to election administration policy and practice. Thanks very much. All right, at this point, we're going to get into our topic in earnest. I want to say a few comments really quickly on this slide, just as kind of a quick level set. I am really pleased to have a diverse group of people in the audience. We have a handful of election administrators that I'm amazed could pull themselves away from their busy work, as well as many other non-election related stakeholders. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that as we talk about incident response planning and the coming election, today's talk is not intended to be disruptive. It is not intended to give you a whole bunch of ideas with more work to do, and it's certainly not about implementing a lot of new stuff at this late date. We know how busy election officials are already working in these challenging circumstances, and we also know that most of them are pretty thin on resources and they are overwhelmed. So with that recognition, our message today is very simple, and it is simply to expect and plan for the unexpected. Obviously, we're going to unpack that and peel that onion quite a bit more, but that's going to involve many levels of different stakeholders, and that's why we're particularly pleased to see that in the attendance list, there are a lot of related groups, whether it's IT, whether it's police departments, other people that are going to need to coordinate with election officials, even if they're not working within that office. So let's start off with the core question. What are we talking about today when we talk about incident response planning? Well, as you can see, an incident response plan is a set of instructions to help detect, respond to, and recover from incidents that impact the perceived or actual integrity of election administration procedures. And I really want to emphasize perceived or actual, because particularly in this area, as most of you know, perception is everything. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in earnest is how to respond to information that might not even be real, obviously disinformation. So the goal of incident response planning is to handle the situation in a way that limits damage and that reduces recovery time and costs. And so for today's purposes, you can really just think of incident response more generally as contingency planning. So at the risk of talking about the obvious, why are these so important right now? Well, one thing that's really important to recognize is when we talk about election security, it actually has multiple dimensions. And today we're going to talk about two of them. First is actually just operational concerns that are related to election administration, strictly speaking. In other words, how is the election actually run? What is the workflow? How are people going to be reaching voters and counting ballots? The second one, in addition to those operational concerns, are technology and cybersecurity concerns. It's really common in these circles, particularly when you talk about incident response, to talk about the latter, about technology and cybersecurity. And there is no doubt they're going to be really important this year. But we actually believe that some of the greatest challenges for election security are likely to come simply from overwhelming operational changes that are associated with the pandemic. And as you can see on the slide, it's that need that so many election officials have had to rapidly change election procedures, combined with both domestic and foreign efforts to interfere, that is creating a really ripe environment for that damaging disinformation that can impact voters' faith in the legitimacy of outcomes. So really, our message today is this. If you remember one thing, and a lot of election officials obviously are already making their contingency plans. Some of you may see, or if you don't already, I'm on Twitter quite a bit, and lately one of the things that I've found both good humor in, but it's also very illustrative, is the number of election officials that are kind of joking about the possibility of an asteroid hitting Earth on election day. And there's a combination of folks that either say, yep, that one is already on my list, or I need to go add that to my list. But our main message is that election officials need to be working on three fronts. They need to be thinking not only about operational and cyber issues of things that could go wrong, but also for nefarious false claims or exaggerations of things that are going wrong. Next slide, please. So really what we're talking about is these three things. You need to be thinking about operations continuity planning, incident response planning in the more traditional sense that a lot of technology and cybersecurity folks are more familiar with. And lastly, of course, is a PR response plan so that when the unexpected does happen, you can communicate effectively to maintain confidence in election operations. So one of the things that's really important is thinking about all of the what ifs. And the simple message we have here is really bullet point 3. Don't simply plan for the happy path. In this year, when so many operational issues have been upended, when there's an increased level of potential voter confusion about what the election procedures are going to be, about calendar dates, about different voting options that are available to them, that is what creates, as we said, this opportunity for sometimes, potentially malicious actors to be really trolling events and trying to create confusion or chaos and division. So if nothing else, even for those election administrators that have thin resources, as many do, and even to the extent that you already have a lot of your contingency planning underway, one of our main messages, again, is simply keep doing that. It's never too late to plan. Even if your resources are constrained, simply thinking ahead is one of the most important things that we can do. The reason that is so critical is one of the things that the primary season has already taught us is how challenging it can be for election administrators to be working on multiple levels. Specifically, the need to provide lots of different options for voters in November. One of the things I want to mention, a lot of the folks in our audience today are, of course, from California. We also have attendees that are from across the country. And although in California, of course, by-mail voting is expected to be very, very high levels, and already for many years, California has made a strong commitment to by-mail voting. It's still true that there are many other election officials in other states that are going to have a learning curve. They're going to need to ramp up, and they're going to need to anticipate in-person voting, perhaps to an even higher degree than might be the case in California, for example. What we learned from the primary season is that there is a dynamic relationship between all these different options for voters, and achieving the right balance can be very challenging. So, for example, an inability to keep up with by-mail voting volumes means that some voters might not receive ballots. Again, in California, they are going to be sending ballots to registered voters. That's not happening in a lot of other states across the union. And if voters don't receive their mail ballots in advance, if election administrators cannot keep up, then that, of course, can lead to last-minute pressures on in-person polling places. What we saw in the elections in places like Wisconsin, in the District of Columbia, and in Georgia is that the inability to keep up with by-mail voting led to very long lines at polling places because sometimes the number of in-person polling places was overcontracted. There was too much consolidation. And the other thing that election officials across the country are really struggling with is a veritable crisis in staffing for in-person polling places. And so all of those things, again, are illustrating how election officials, as difficult as it may sound, even with vastly inadequate resources, they have to effectively be prepared to run multiple elections in their jurisdictions. They simply cannot afford to put all of their eggs in one basket. In many states where in prior years, maybe their by-mail voting volumes might have accounted for as little as 5 or 10% of their total cast votes, and that's not going to be the case this year. So providing those different options is going to be essential. And this, again, the reliance on by-mail voting, the reliance on particular types of cybersecurity infrastructure is also creating new challenges, and this is where the disinformation comes in. So with that, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to OSET's Chief Technology Officer, John Sebas, to start talking about some of those technology issues in earnest.
Well, thanks, Eddie. So want to really reiterate what Eddie said about the changes in election procedures that COVID has driven. So whenever you change your procedures and the way that you rely on technology for them in elections, certainly that increases the scope for cybersecurity threats. It changes the threat model. It makes some things much more attractive to adversaries. And in each of those cases, it also increases the risk for disinformation. And that's why we have a core message today that contingency planning is really an integrated incident response plan across planning for cyber incidents, planning for physical incidents, planning for operational security incidents, so that if and when any of those things happen, you already have a pre-planned PR response that you can execute quickly, whether the incident is cyber or not, and whether it's real or not. So with that preface, I want to just give some examples of the type of cyber incidents that would be possible and particularly important in this election based on the unique characteristics of it. So certainly before the election, voters need help getting registered, understanding how to get an absentee ballot if they want one, understanding what their options are for voting in person. And many of those things, the in-person factor has completely evaporated. And so just the technology for outreach, for communicating with voters, all by itself, that becomes much more critical than it was previously, and it becomes a target as well. Of course, we all know that voter registration systems are an important information technology target for meddling with elections, but it's even more important now with the expansion of by-mail voting, that the accuracy of those things, those voter rolls, is maintained. So for example, for many people, having a correct mailing address wasn't a big important thing before. This is the first time they might be voting by mail in a long time. What if their mailing address is out of date? What if there's been a mistake with it? God forbid, what if there's been a malicious mistake? But it doesn't matter whether it's malicious or not. The integrity and accuracy of voter records becomes even more important as we're moving in some states to dramatically induced by-mail voting. So that's an example of how the threat landscape has changed given with the pandemic-driven changes of this particular election. Absentee ballot request services are also something that's in some states brand new, with encouraging people to vote from home instead of in person for public health reasons. The states that require an absentee ballot request, some of them have brought on brand new systems for doing an online absentee ballot request. And again, anytime you bring on a new system, it's a new asset that could be at risk, and you have new threats to that. Signature verification, just to keep on with the theme of what happens when you do a shift to so much vote by mail. Those signature verification systems become much more critical as the absentee volume grows. And again, those are one of the things that in prior elections we didn't really think, oh, is that a critical IT asset? Well, in this one it definitely is, and that includes not just the signature verification stuff, but everything that has to do with it, including reaching back to DMV systems to get signatures of record to compare against. So now we have DMV databases being really, really critical to the election process in a way that perhaps we didn't imagine before. So if I could ask for the next slide, I want to give some similar examples for disinformation attacks. And these are going to sound kind of similar because the main theme that I have here is that each one of these disinfo attacks corresponds to what could be real attacks and maybe aren't, or maybe they are. Each of these disinfo attacks corresponds to different types of physical or operational parts of elections administration or elections operation where there could be a real problem or maybe not. So just run through a few examples. What happens if some voters are not listed in the poll books? That happens in many cases in many elections. But in this situation, that is ripe fodder for disinformation about cyber operations or about electoral fraud. What if an unusually high number of provisional ballots are distributed? That could happen because people are unfamiliar with their options for in-person voting because guess what? They changed, right? So changes in election operations, in this case driven by a pandemic, create confusion on the voters' part, or create requirements for election officials to do voter outreach to help them understand what their options are. And when people don't understand them and don't understand the response to these changes, that again provides real situations that can be vastly exaggerated by disinfo. Of course, the traditional voting machines not operating properly is another one. But again, the risk for that, it has a particular piquant this election because so many places are operating new voting machines. We saw in the primaries that unfamiliarity with new technology could really create the appearance of significant technical issues, whether it's real or not. By mail ballots being misprinted or being sent out improperly, we've seen that already in the primaries. So the ability to exaggerate those or claim disenfranchisement or claim intentional disenfranchisement is really, really significant. Of course, then we've got some detection of invalid or fake by mail ballots is something that could really be exaggerated because, of course, we have invalid by mail ballots in every election. That's the election official's job to sort through all the incoming and decide which ones are supposed to be counted. But that's not very well understood. Then there's the rejection of by mail ballots. Again, a normal part of the elections process. Not every by mail ballot that arrives is legitimate for being counted, but the unfamiliarity with that process and the unfamiliarity with the reasons for rejection, more fodder for disinfo. And then, of course, we've just got straight up fake information about how to vote, where to vote. Faked information maybe by sort of low-end cyber attacks on website defacement, but certainly can be really demoralizing. So I hope what I've covered here is several of the things that could go wrong. Murphy, it's sort of a condensation of OSET's Murphy's Guide to 2020 elections. You'll see that at the end, both on the cyber side and on the operations side, with the message that we need to be prepared for blended attacks that may include elements of both cyber operations, physical, and may include elements of outright falsification or just maybe exaggeration of real things that are happening that election officials had a contingency plan for and are executing that contingency plan. But it needs to be adequately prepared, both for the contingency planning and the PR planning to respond to that. Important considerations, next slide, for building an incident response plan. Well, I'll give the basics and I'll hand off to Eddie to talk more about the broader issue of crisis communication planning. But at the very basic level, an incident response plan starts with an assessment of all the types of things that could go wrong and which ones, if they did go wrong, would significantly impair the election in terms of the ability to conduct the election, or could create a really significant opportunity for misrepresenting what's going on. Election being stolen, stuff like that. So the beginning of it is not just working inside an elections organization to identify those, but to work across stakeholders, multiple other stakeholders that support elections offices. And so part of what we're doing today is to try to educate some of those other stakeholders, supporting stakeholders, about the challenges that election officials face to integrate their response planning for these various types of threats. So Eddie, back to you for the broader picture of how that feeds into a whole crisis communication plan.
Thank you, John. And Jimmy, if we could go ahead and I think we need to move up 2 slides. Actually, you can leave right here. Actually, if you'll stay right there for just a moment. I want to emphasize in the transition that John just mentioned here. One of the best things that election administrators and their related stakeholders can do, and these are going to need to be necessarily tailored to your particular jurisdiction because there is no one-size-fits-all set of conditions, is to think about what are the symptoms that you are going to be looking for when you need to make a determination, is this something that needs to be escalated? And then, of course, if something does need to be escalated, the natural question is to whom? Is it the IT staff? Is it a different portion of the county's communications office? Is it local law enforcement? And what are those notification procedures? Next slide, please. One of the other things also that's going to be really critical is figuring out in advance, what are the things that you anticipate that are likely to be routine? What are the things that might be more nefarious in origin that you're going to be watching for? And lastly, what are real showstoppers? And the classic things in incident response planning are containment, eradication, and recovery. Next slide, please. If incident response planning is, as I mentioned, about the identification, detection, containment, and recovery from the type of operational or cyber attacks that can happen, that's really just the precursor to then talking about the wider public about what's going on if that becomes necessary. Obviously, you need to gather the information first, and then the question becomes, what are we going to say? And how are we going to do it? So critical to that is, what are the thresholds when issues are being escalated? I've already mentioned several of the potential other stakeholder groups that are going to lie outside maybe the elections office, strictly speaking. Media, law enforcement agencies, other local or state officials. Consider the legal department as well. And as far as best practices for a crisis communication plan, it should come as no surprise, and we're not even going to attempt to cover all of this in the time we have here. Like everything else in today's presentation, we're hoping to give you some kind of top line items to become checklists for future research. These are the really kind of core best practices in building a crisis communication plan. In addition to the escalation that I already mentioned, and at the risk of stating the obvious, your communications in a crisis should be about and in response to what are the public's concerns and their needs. It may sound a little prosaic, but it really is true. There are plenty of communications professionals that do case studies in crisis communications, and sometimes the very organizations that are undergoing such crises, they end up talking about the problem sort of through their own eyes, or insofar as how it might affect themselves. You obviously need to take that outward view, and you need to put yourself in the shoes of voters, of the media, of people that are maybe seeing disinformation in social media. So make the communications about their concerns and needs. Transparency is obviously critical, but you also need to be careful about it. And the reason to be careful about it is a lot of crisis situations are going to be unfolding rapidly, and they may also frequently have fragmented information. You may not know what's going on at any given moment. And so you need to walk a balance between, on the one hand, taking that issue seriously, but there are also situations where you don't want to provide information that might change or impact the investigation process that might still be underway. Next, focus on the actions that you are taking. Try to be very specific and concrete about what your county, your township, your jurisdiction, what changes have been made, what other potential bodies or actors have been activated, and what is being done. And just like any other communication or media story, providing context in the sense of locating what is going on within a bigger picture. Are there precursor steps that you need to explain? Is there some amount of kind of preliminary public education that will help people to better understand what is going on? That can also be really critical. Next slide, please. And as we've already mentioned, in this ripe environment for disinformation, and one of the things that John Sevis mentioned that's really right on the nose is disinformation can come in many different forms. It might be malicious. It might be an outright falsehood. It might be a combination of something that actually did happen, but now it has been heightened and exaggerated with additional bad information to create more chaos. Many different varieties of disinformation. And one of the most important things when you're countering it is you need to develop the counter messages, and they need to be simple, and you need to be able to deliver them quickly. It is almost certainly no surprise to everybody in the audience that social media is one of the fastest ways for misinformation and disinformation to travel. And so if you're not already thinking about all of the many, many different multiple platforms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, whether it's other websites, other types of social groups, you need to be prepared to engage on those multiple platforms and ideally avoid repeating the misinformation. Next slide. So in conclusion, I want to reiterate what we said at the top of this talk. In the first place, I do absolutely want to recognize, and we have tried to be very efficient in a minimal amount of time, that the point of today's talk is hopefully to either confirm at a kind of mental checklist level the types of activities that you're already engaged in, simply give you some top line items that we think you should be thinking about, and potentially filling in some gaps. Again, we believe really strongly that regardless of your resources at the moment, contingency planning can always go farther. One of the things I read lately, and I like it, is planners plan. That's what you do. Even though the election is really right around the corner and most election officials are already deep in their activities there, continuing to try to anticipate the unknowns can be very helpful. And that doesn't need to be about doing new things or implementing new things. In fact, in most places, implementing something at this date is not going to be possible. I also want to emphasize that the best thing, not only for election officials, but for all of the related stakeholder groups, is think both about what are the actual things that could go wrong and what are the falsehoods that people could say about it? What are the types of disinformation that could come? Because whether a challenge is real or whether somebody is trolling, that's a big part of our message. You need to be prepared for both. And finally, as I already noted, again, there is no one-size-fits-all solution here. Every locality is going to have to think in a customized way about what can go wrong given the methods of voting that you are doing in your jurisdiction. And the most important thing is, for those particular operational conditions, again, what are the symptoms you're going to be looking for? What is routine? What is suspicious? What is downright critical? What is the point at which you're going to escalate to other groups that need to be included in your communications planning, and who are those groups? So if nothing else, and again, especially given the fact that there are so many related organizations in attendance today, whether they are, again, police departments, IT teams, and so forth, if nothing else, we hope that today's kind of high-level checklist will encourage you to have more of those cross-team, cross-stakeholder kinds of collaborations. And Jimmy will talk a little bit later, again, about additional opportunities in the future to delve into those more deeply. We're going to leave you with 2 slides, as others like to say in webinars. If this is the part where maybe you want to take out a smartphone and snap a couple pictures of the screen. With respect to incident response planning for elections in particular, it's very gratifying that this year, because there's so much demand for it, there is a pretty decent supply of resources. Actually, if you'll jump back just real quick, Jimmy, one thing I want to emphasize that on this first slide, all of these are specifically related to incident response planning within the election space. The Center for Infrastructure Security, Department of Homeland Security, National Association of Secretaries of State, and the EAC. So some very solid, trusted resources there with really good templates that can really give you a leg up. And next slide. And finally, turning from incident response planning to communications planning, more specifically, the 2 of the best opportunities that are out there are from Harvard's Belfer Center. And they do have an excellent communications coordination guide as well as a planning template. And as John and others mentioned, the OSET Institute also very recently took our own shot at what are the many things that could go wrong in the 2020 election that people should plan for. And there is a link there. And I think that wraps it up. And I will turn it back to you, Jimmy, for our next portion.
Actually, Jimmy, I'm just going to jump in for a quick second here to thank Eddie for going through those many things and providing those resources. And I just wanted to emphasize the most important part of what we do is respect for the election officials, that it's our mission to help. So I want to underline the point that it's integration, both internally and externally. integration internally of all the contingency planning that you're already doing, incident response planning you're already doing, PR planning that you can continue to do right up towards election day, and then integrating externally with other stakeholders who can be of assistance. And I wanted to pass that back to Jimmy, in addition to his concluding remarks, also to give some overview of what that extended stakeholder community is, whether it's UASIs or ISACs or ISAOs, alphabet soup. But decode that for us a bit, Jimmy, as well, if you would.
No, I would be happy to as well. And let me just do a quick statement before I answer that. We're just right around 11:30 now. Our national audience has stayed with us. We're going to transition here really quickly for the next 15 minutes, and we're going to do Q&A. And what John was referring to, Cal Poly's California Cybersecurity Institute, we do a lot of work with MESAC as well as, and this is the one that will tongue tie you, UASIs, Urban Area Security Initiatives. And these are all groups that work with fusion centers in your states as well as different city and county governments. So we're happy to talk to you on that. Again, I want to thank our audience for staying with us. John and Eddie, riveting presentation. I learned a lot just by listening. We've had a multitude of questions come in through chat. I want to try to hit on 3 or 4 of them before we wrap up today. So one of the first questions came in. I think this is a great question: is do election officials really have time to worry about this in the next couple months? I mean, we're almost at September. November's coming. Do they really have time to consider some of these things? John, if you take a shot at that, and then maybe Eddie could follow on.
Unmute. Great. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is absolutely yes. The reason that election officials do have time for this at this time is because what we're talking about is what they're already doing. Over the longer term, election officials have been building threat awareness and response capability with assistance from Homeland Security and others. They've been doing their usual contingency planning for continuity of operations. They've been doing PR planning. Their IT groups have been, over the last several months, focusing on cybersecurity improvements in response planning. It's all been happening. So what we're really talking about today is how all that gets affected by the double whammy of nation-state adversaries and then unexpected changes in the way elections are run because of the pandemic. And that's why integrating across all these things that election officials are already doing is even more important than usual because of that double whammy, but it's an extension of what's already happening.
Thanks, John. Eddie, did you care to comment on that before we jump to the next question?
Sorry, I had to unmute. The only thing that I would add by way of emphasis, because I think John is spot on, figuring out your operations and figuring out your continuity of operations, election officials are already figuring out, well, what do I do if something goes wrong? I think that there's just one additional lesson, note of emphasis from today is ask yourself, have you gone beyond the channels of your own office and already started anticipating who else might need to know things and at what point, if any of that continuity of operations were affected, for example.
Thanks, Eddie. We have another question on the worry front. So a couple worries coming in. This question is also a really good one, but how much do we really need to worry about hacking, especially from cyber operations of nation states? And I know in our world, we talk about nation states all the time and the attacks that are going on against America. But what right now do people need to be concerned about? Is that a very serious thing?
Well, since I'm the sort of cybersecurity old hand, as well as national critical infrastructure, there's a really weirdly unique answer to that question for election land. And the answer is take the threat seriously, but focus on response planning and be realistic. So elections organizations have by now done all the cybersecurity improvements that they can this year. If there are incidents where cyber attack is actually a factor, be realistic. That won't be confirmed until after the election. So election officials and all their supporting infrastructure colleagues really just need to focus on being prepared to maintain public confidence in the face of incidents that might or might not be hacking, might or might not be real, regardless of whether they later turn out to be true or whether they later turn out to be pure disinformation.
Mhm. You know, we had another question come in along the lines of disinformation campaigns of nation states, but should something happen in your community, what are the best ways to communicate issues with all the noise on social media?
Well, I'll take a brief crack at the beginning of that, but I'll also want Eddie to weigh in on it. Disinfo attacks, the threat is real. DHS, CISA has confirmed a growing list of nation state actors that are already seeking to influence US elections, including to discredit the integrity of the process and the legitimacy of the results. So that's why preparedness for these attacks is more important than ever, particularly that integration that I mentioned before. And we have to remember that the pandemic has created the need for several late-stage changes to operations. Changes to operations create risks for operational glitches or public misunderstanding, and those create the opportunities for disinfo actors. Eddie?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Jimmy. I would simply add Cal Poly and many of the counties and others that are in attendance. You all have the good fortune of being in a state that actually, the state of California has one of the better institutionalized and better thought out efforts to both monitor, detect, and respond to disinformation in the election space. And that is actually being managed in association with the California Secretary of State. So what I would mention in that context, at the risk of stating the obvious, is number one, assume that disinformation is going to happen and it's going to keep happening. It is happening now. It is likely to increase. And secondly, it is going to be a resource question, but you should be asking yourselves, what are the ways that I can make efforts to monitor on the most popular channels what disinformation might be spread about this county, about voting in this county, and so forth. And then again, if that monitoring is taking place, you need to respond as quickly as possible with official communication channels that are setting the facts straight. And I would simply conclude, and Jimmy, we will provide this to the Cybersecurity Institute. We can make available links with appropriate personnel at California SOS that are working on this issue and that can provide additional support.
Now, that would be great. Hey, I want to take, we have two more exceptional questions that have come in. The audience is staying with us throughout the country, so I think it's worth answering these while we're talking. And for those of you that we can't get to your questions today, John, Eddie, and myself will respond back to everybody electronically. But just take a quick moment. There are two questions I want you all to answer. This one just came in too. What's the possibility of fake official notices? Can election officials have their Twitter feed certified in time?
That is a really good question.
Yeah, it is.
So the one part of preparedness is increasing the control you have over social media. So certification, example of Twitter, is important. But it really doesn't stop there, because as we've seen with Joe Biden's Twitter account getting hacked because of a really good social engineering attack on Twitter employees. Those are basic measures you need to take, but one of the contingencies to plan for is your own social media being abused against you, and the ability to quickly respond to that, not only just to recover control of it, but to keep ahead of the message that this is not affecting the way elections are actually being operated. Great question.
Thanks, John. We're going to go to the last question of the day here, and this one just came in. Since elections are very layered, town, county, state, any advice on when, who, and how to take the lead on the transparent communication? The follow-on says, I would think this would be a critical part of pre-planning or scenario planning.
Well, I would kick that right back to you, Jimmy, because I think at least for California, CCI has done such an amount of work in identifying the relationships between all the stakeholders at those levels. I think that much of the need for communication comes from the bottom up, from local election officials handling stuff at the local level. There's a role at the state level too as well, but so many other stakeholders. And I would kick back, Jimmy, and just say how CCI's expertise can help election officials navigate the answer to that very good question.
No, I agree with it. We've had, over the last couple months, we've had requests come in from the Urban Area Security Initiative. So, in every state, there are a handful of them. And they have asked us, and particularly, hey, we need some help with this. Because the one thing that, we've been talking about election officials, but disinformation campaigns have a much broader attack surface when you think of all the other people involved in a city and planning and responding to those things. I will say this for everyone else listening in, if you'll join us in a couple weeks, we are going to do a deeper dive segment on the information that we've touched here on today. Before I conclude the event, Eddie, John, any last words? Or are we good to wrap up?
I'll just add one note on that last question, which I think is very, very important. Given the fact that so much of election administration is multi-layered, I would emphasize what John said about bottom-up planning. And what I mean by that is whether you're starting at, say, the township level and then working up to the county level, or if elections are run at the county and that you have typical sorts of interactions with the state. If you think of it as a pyramid in that way, step one, assuming that, as is safe to assume, that each of those election jurisdictions, they're going to be the best experts about their own operations and about what could go wrong. And further assuming that they have already anticipated what those potential symptoms and crises might be, I think the critical question then is to always be asking yourself, have I communicated up to whoever is my next partner in the chain? Have I done that actively? Do I know exactly who on that team I need to be talking to? Have we provided any sort of transparency on the types of contingencies that we need to be thinking about? And I think that anticipating both the collaboration and providing some transparency on what each jurisdiction knows best for itself, that will really give you the leg up in having an agile response when something happens, and let's hope it does not.
I want to take just a quick 30 seconds to highlight some upcoming events. We mentioned these earlier in the broadcast. I hope that you all will take time to join us on September 10th, where we're going to go into a little more details on the topics we talked about today. Also, after the November election, we're going to be doing an analysis of it on January 13th. We'll make sure everyone listening in today gets a link when we begin registration for that. I want to take a moment. John and Eddie, you're hearing a virtual applause going around the country. I really appreciate you both. This was truly a riveting discussion. On behalf of Cal Poly's California Cybersecurity Institute, the OSET Institute, and the TrusttheVote Project, I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us.
Yes.
Make it a great day.
Thank you all very much, particularly those in the audience that are helping democracy go. Thank you.